and it's my privilege to welcome you all and thank you for joining us today for this workshop on technology and the patient consumer. It is the fifth workshop on this general theme of the impact of technological change in medicine that Dr. Rosenberg and I are holding together. We usually do it at the Jewish General Hospital. Today it's online for reasons that are known to us all. My name is Dr Schlich. I'm a professor at the Department of Social Studies of Medicine at McGill. And I'm one of the organizers of this event together with Dr. Rachel Elder. Dr. Elder is a medical historian and a research associate at the Department of Social Studies of Medicine. And in the following, I will speak for both of us. Now, this workshop would not be possible without the support of various people and various institutions. And first of all, Rachel and I want to thank Barbara Rainey of the General Hospital, the Jewish General Hospital, for a competent and efficient organizational role in the workshop. You've all been in contact with her, and among other things, she has taken care of the registration for the workshop. She sent out the Zoom links to you, and this morning you could see that she was also responsible for making me aware of the problem of the passcodes, and that she reacted very quickly and sent you the passcodes. So she's really behind the management organization of this event, as you can see. And she also produced the fabulous program brochure that you all have. So a lot of the information that you will be interested in is in that program: the abstracts, short bios of all the speakers, and the discussion chairs. And it's advisable to download it because it will just be visually better when it's downloaded.
Thank you, Thomas.
We also want to, thank you, Barbara. We also want to thank the Jewish General Hospital and in particular Dr. Rosenberg for his role in holding this workshop. Our thanks also go to the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, SSHRC. It was a connection grant from SSHRC that has been the most important funding source for this workshop. We also thank the Department of Social Studies of Medicine for supporting this event, as well as the McGill Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences, the Integrated Health and Social Services University Network for West Central Montreal, and the Canadian Institutes for Health Research, CIHR. And of course, we want to thank all the speakers and discussion chairs for being with us today. So, as I said, the workshop is the fifth workshop on this thematic area of the impact of technological change in medicine that Dr. Rosenberg and I have been holding together at the Jewish General Hospital. And this time the topic is technology and the patient consumer. So each of the workshops had a different focus. This time it's the patient consumer. It's a 2-day workshop. So it's happening today and tomorrow, morning and afternoon, 9:30 to 3:30 with breaks, of course. So you can check the scheduling in the program brochure, and the format is online via Zoom. Now, the different sessions have assigned discussion chairs, and each of the sessions has several speakers. It's usually 2 speakers. One exception is this welcome session. Now I have more speakers. And each speaker is giving a presentation of 20 to 25 minutes. That's the idea in the normal case, in the normal sessions. And this is followed by a discussion period of the same length. Okay. The presenters will show their slides by using the share screen function of Zoom. And to do that, each of the speakers will be made co-hosts for their presentations. Now, the task of the discussion chairs is to give a brief introduction of the speakers, to take care of the timing, and to lead the discussions. And of course, the chairs are also very welcome to give comments and ask questions. Now, how's the discussion going to be held? For the discussion period, we are asking everybody to indicate that they have a question or a comment by writing in the Zoom chat that they do. So you don't need to write the question itself. Just write that you have a question, and that will automatically give us a speakers list in the chat, and the discussion chairs can use that speakers list. Okay. So you, for those who are not familiar With Zoom, there is a button on your screen that says chat. You click on it, and then you will be able to write that you have a question. That's enough for now. You don't have to ask the question in the Zoom. Because the question themselves, I would like to ask you to pose in person through Zoom. And you might want to open your camera when you do that if possible. Now, as we did it with all previous workshops, the workshop sessions will be recorded and they will be made publicly accessible afterwards. That's important for you to know. Now, this is the point when I usually tell participants that the toilets are down the hallway. And I think we can skip that point today. Before we move on, do you have any questions? If that's not the case at this point, I will tell you that the first session today is this welcome session, and it's a bit different from the later sessions. The chair is Dr. Faraj. Thanks for joining, Samer. He's a professor of the Dissertals Faculty of Management at McGill. And he will, when he starts the session, he will give a very short introduction to the topic from his perspective, because he's a specialist in technology, innovation, and organization. So that will be very useful for us. He will then introduce the speakers. The speakers today for the first session are Dr. Rachel Elder, and Dr. Lawrence Rosenberg. So thanks a lot for coming. And Samer, I give you the floor as the chair of our first session.
Thank you, Thomas, for this informative and overview of this very timely and exciting workshop on technology and the patient. I'm very glad to be here and to be part of this. I guess it's a fifth Impact of Technological Change workshop hosted at the Jewish General Hospital. So my name is Dr. Faraj, and I teach at the Faculty of Management at McGill. And I hold a secondary appointment with the Department of Social Studies of Medicine. So you can guess that my expertise is at that intersection of management and healthcare. So the topic of this year's edition, the technology and the patient consumer, is of particular interest to me, given that I sit in management, right? So we will be hearing a lot about the patient consumer, or maybe I should say the patient as a consumer, over the next 2 days. In many ways, healthcare is one of the last industries to feel the pressure from stakeholders and from the general public to take the consumer experience seriously and to involve what used to be known as a product or the carrier of the disease more fully in the care experience. So thinking comparatively, you can think of universities where we have had experience and difficulty with the consumer orientation. And we have debated for a long time whether students are consumers. It's a slippery slope because while we can all agree that students are the natural consumers of the knowledge produced by the university, we are often asked to view them as customers. So professors, like medical doctors, have refused to accept the notion that students or patients can rate or even be involved in the complex knowledge work that we do. How could they? They lack the expertise. They don't have the advanced degrees that figure out prominently on our office walls, or to demonstrate our expertise and establish that we know what we're talking about. So yet today, it has become routine for students to rate professors or the classes they just took. Students use routinely these publicly available ratings and rankings to make choices about what classes to take, which professors to avoid, or even which university to attend. Deans and administrators have adopted the student ratings, i.e. the consumer experience, as a shorthand to quantify professors' teaching performances. Sadly, much of the promotion files are in academia are now dependent on these magical consumer-driven scores. Even programs, faculties, and universities now have had to accept that they'll be ranked comparatively and that the consumer experience a major part of those rankings. Thus, the pressure is growing on the healthcare providers to orient themselves to serve customers, just like happens in other industries. But before we can start repeating the aphorism, the customer is always right, there are certain issues and complications. So first, the customer standpoint assumes that the consumer can evaluate the encounter or the medical procedure, something that is difficult to accept given the complexity of the healthcare encounter and long-term experience. Second, it is based on the assumption that there's an array of offerings, just like a marketplace, that the customer can choose from. Implicit in the thinking, the customer has agency, the power of choice. They can, as they say, take their business elsewhere and vote with their feet and go to a different practitioner. Again, this is something difficult to implement in places like Canada, where given the scarcity of family doctors and the difficulty of finding a specialist available to see a patient or to perform a needed procedure in a timely manner. So the question in front of us is whether healthcare providers, whether the healthcare can be improved by introducing the patient's viewpoint and experience in the measurement of healthcare. So maybe the idea of a patient customer is a bridge too far, but the patient consumer is here today and its arrival is overdue. Patients given a diagnosis almost universally educate themselves about their condition. How could they not? As the saying goes, they have skin in the game, and thus they are involved. They will want to discuss, ask questions. They will challenge traditional notions about traditional medical wisdom. They will ask about new experimental procedures. They would want to discuss treatment plans. And doctors often tell horror stories about patients who bring in some dubious news dredged from the bowels of the internet and use it to question hard-earned expertise. Indeed, we all laugh at those stories. So maybe the patient is not this is not the time to go toward the patient becoming a customer yet. We have a lot of technologies that are coming that are changing what we can do. So the moment has come to realize that we may be moving away from an encounter-based health system to one that is increasingly built on a longer-term and more productive relationship. These possibilities need to be explored seriously. Many are afforded by new technologies. We'll hear more about these during the workshop, and I am excited to be part of it and listen to the research and the analysis that has been put on the program. I'll simply point you that new technology affordances, such as telehealth consultation that the COVID pandemic has forced us to adopt. I'll point you to the electronic health records, such as in Quebec, the Dossier Santé Québec have become easily available to patients as much as to practitioners everywhere. Another coming technology revolution is the advent of wearable devices, just as the Apple Watch, that are constantly capturing and relaying important health information. So in conclusion, the era of healthcare where doctors had a monopoly on medical knowledge and inhabited the large standalone hospital, and the patients were perceived as primarily an embodied disease, is reaching an end. Many innovations are here to help us bridge to a 21st century health system that is more decentralized and more important, that recognizes the patient as part of the care team. How we get there has been the focus of these workshops on technological change. So how the healthcare provider's relationship with the patient is the focus of this year's edition. And I look forward from learning from rich perspectives today. To start things off, I'll now turn to our first speaker, which is Dr. Rachel Elder, who will give us a somewhat historic look at the concept of the patient consumer. She is currently a research associate in the Department of Social Studies of Medicine at McGill, and is a historian of modern medicine, technology, disability, and culture. She's currently writing a book on epilepsy in the 20th century America. Rachel, I'll pass it on to you. And after we hear from Rachel, we will be back to our introductory speech by Dr. Lawrence Rosenberg. Rachel, to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I am just gonna share my screen and, oh, where's my PowerPoint? It's not giving me PowerPoint as an option in the screen share. Very sorry. Let me reopen it. No, I don't know why it wouldn't. Anytime I've used Zoom, I'm very sorry about this. I guess alternatively, what I can do is just share my desktop and you'll see what that looks like. And then I'll just launch the, oh, there it is. Okay, sorry for the delay here. Can everybody see that in non-presenter mode? Thomas, can you?
We can see it. We can
okay,
see
perfect, perfect. Okay. All right. So the idea for my part of this introduction is really just to provide some common groundwork and framing for our topic of technology and the patient consumer, and also to highlight some of the major themes and questions connecting the presentations over the next few days. So we talked a little bit about the program. I think probably most of you have seen it at this point, but I'll just point out a few things. So apart from our introductory session, including our next talk by Dr. Rosenberg, and then a group discussion at the end, what we essentially have are 8 talks, all, as I think Thomas mentioned, are by historians, which differs from past conferences. And all are working at the intersections of history of medicine, history of technology, as well as a number of other subspecialties. All you might notice are on quite different topics and kinds of technologies. Okay, so ranging from those commonly used in hospitals to more decentralized and home use technologies, things like tampons, tanning beds. All are focused on the US this time and span the early 20th century to the present. Okay, so a wide variety of content, but with each paper, I think thinking critically about the role of technology in modern medicine and also how patients feature in these stories, especially when we begin to think of patients as consumers. I'll also quickly point out our 3 main thematic areas, which are bolded. First, this morning, we have marketing and consumption, which in addition to looking at different kinds of technologies, considers the mechanisms by which patients have been marketed to and thus made into consumers. So advertising, for example, will be important here. Next, starting this afternoon, we have 2 panels, the next being tomorrow morning, on risk and danger, where I think that issues of information and patient self-advocacy really start to come in, largely around contested medical technologies and the various crises of confidence and health that they produce. And then finally, tomorrow, we have a panel on access and demand, where the papers in different ways are looking more closely at the concept of patient choice, to consider both who is driving the uptake of new medical technologies. Is it patients? To what extent? But also, what is this? What does choice even mean when we begin to think about some of the vast inequalities within the healthcare system and society more broadly. Okay, so I'll start with the patient consumer because although we've talked about it a little bit so far, it may not be an entirely self-evident term. Today, of course, we often see patient and consumer used almost interchangeably, depending on the context, or sometimes this compound term of patient-consumer. And I suspect that Dr. Rosenberg will explore, if not problematize, this conflation in more depth. Within a historical frame, though, the two books on the slide here can help us think through some definitions and origins and the extent to which it's a useful term and category, or at least for historians. So on the right, we have Alex Mould's Making the Patient Consumer, which focuses on the British context. And then on the left, Nancy Toms's Remaking the American Patient, i.e. into a consumer, which focuses on the United States. By the way, can you see my cursor? If I circle things, if I point to things, perfect, okay. So both of these books are essentially charting how the landscape of medicine came to resemble and operate as a consumer market, how patients became more actively engaged in selecting procedures, buying health products, what Toms in places equates to shopping, and also how health information became ubiquitous rather than concentrated mainly in the hands of practitioners. Being historians, both are also placing this phenomenon within a deeper past, certainly than the 21st century, but also further back than what's usually attributed to the social ferment of the 1960s and 70s, taking hold with the materialism of the 1980s, and culminating in the rise of the internet and direct-to-consumer marketing in the 1990s. Okay, so these are the usual plot points, largely landing on digital technologies as the point of arrival. At the same time as Dr. Faraj alluded to, context and place matters. So for Mould in the UK, the patient consumer is something she's tracing to patient groups in the 1950s, about a decade after the rise of the NHS, and thus shows that patient consumerism, at least originally, was much more rooted in collectivism rather than the model of the individualized patient that we see emerge by the Thatcher era. Okay, so more of a bottom-up kind of story. For Toms in the American context, and this is of course where our presentations will lie, she's arguing that the patient consumer is instead a product of the longer-term entanglements of medicine with modern business, as well as other broader changes surrounding medical care. Okay, so I've just outlined some of this on the next slide here. All right, so on the right, she looks back to the progressive era, starting with the rise of mass consumerism towards the end of the 19th century, but also key movements towards greater regulation, both in and around medicine, growing specialization among practitioners, changes in advertising, massive hospital building projects after World War II, and for our purposes, a growing array of ever more costly medical technologies. And this is something she spends less time on, and I think where some of the papers in this workshop intervene. And then on the left here, I've just included the more standard periodization that I alluded to earlier, including major breaches of treatment, social and civil rights movements that were keenly focused on health and health disparities, and this more general distrust of medical institutions and expertise that you see by the 1970s. Okay, and no one's discounting the significance of this historical shift. I know that for Toms, the objective is to place the patient consumer in a much longer and broader explanatory framework. This next slide is just a summary. It's definitely not a one-to-one. We're focused more again over here. But I include it again to highlight the ways in which this may or may not be a distinctly American story. Some I think would argue that it is, but at the very least, when thinking about the patient consumer, we need to take into consideration the healthcare systems and histories in which these stories unfold. So in the US, for instance, the main focus has really been on individualized patients as consumers, with a real emphasis on individual discernment and choice. Again, the last talk, this is sort of key, but also being up to date on state-of-the-art treatment options, And then also thinking about how this fits within a largely private and segmented healthcare system. Regardless of place, though, I'll just note the need for strong analyses of race, class, gender, disability, and our understandings of what and who is the patient consumer. Tom's, for one, has noted its designation primarily to white middle-class Americans throughout this 20th century arc she's tracing. But really, whether we're using it as an actors or an analysts category, it's important to realize that consumer tends to connote certain kinds of privilege. I've pulled this quote because I think it provides some good touchstones and keywords for our discussion, or discussions, I should say. Certainly some hallmarks of patient consumerism, both in the past and the present, has been this emphasis on information, choice, and voice, what we can maybe think as essentially amounting to patient agency. So that's one quote, and sorry, I know I'm moving fast here. Likewise, what this then means for how individual patients navigate complex systems and decisions around their health, which, as suggested here, is the real utility of the term and concept. So I actually had a number of examples that I've cut for time, but I will just say that this point about decision-making is particularly key, in many cases serving as the very definition of what it means to be a patient consumer. Okay, so especially in contemporary examples, I think the consumer or patient consumer is often defined in contrast to the patient, whereas the consumer is active, characterized by choice and self-advocacy, communication and organization with other patients, greater partnership with one's doctors. You see partnership used a lot. The patient, on the other hand, is then caricatured as less informed and subject to a more hierarchical relationship with medical professionals and the medical system more generally. Oops. Okay, and this image just highlights this dichotomy further. It comes from an article by a community organization written for seniors titled, "Are you a patient or are you a consumer?" And again, I cut the text, but it's clear that the goal is to be the latter, okay, this more active category. Okay, so interestingly, what we see then is not only consumer describe the more market-based aspects of medicine, but also in so doing serve almost as a corrective to some idea of the patient as a passive recipient of medicine. And we can talk about whether this has ever been the case. Certainly this view is problematic for a few reasons, not least I think because regardless of your status, being sick is rarely a story about being in control. Okay, so much more could be said here, and we can pick up on any of this in the discussion, but I do want to spend a few minutes talking about technology. Okay. A lot of keywords in this conference. Okay, so co-evolving with these changes in what it means to be a patient is the changing role of technology itself. Historians often note that before the 20th century, medicine and the hospital were sparsely populated with what we would today consider to be technology, but that really by the 1910s and 20s, a number of new devices and techniques began to change the appearance as well as the primary place of care. Okay, so one consequence of technology being that it more firmly centers care within the hospital. These developments include a variety of diagnostic and therapeutic technologies, things like X-ray machines, but also less obvious ones, including those of health information and scientific management, things like standardized patient forms and the application of statistics and new accounting practices. Important for our purposes is that each of these developments also greatly changed the experience of being a patient. So Joel Howell, for example, memorably argued that two patients entering the same hospital with a broken leg in 1900 versus 1925 had very different experiences, ranging from how they were diagnosed to how many days they stayed in the hospital and even the lengths of their patient records, which I've summarized here. Technology is also important because it radically reshapes labor and expertise. So this is less the focus. Oh, hold on, I've got a cloud message. I don't know if you guys saw that. So this question of labor and expertise is less the focus of this workshop, but still important, especially when we begin to think about those technologies not centered in the hospital or the hands of doctors and nurses, including things like over-the-counter medications, home thermometers and pregnancy tests, or those that allow patients to share and circulate information with greater ease. Okay, so we can maybe think a little bit about technologies associated with patients and perhaps how those stories might be different from the concerns you see, for example, around de-skilling and routinization in histories of nursing. And the work of Margaret Sandalowski comes to mind here. Where, in other words, do patients become either the primary or co-consumers and users of medical technologies, and what are the various lessons there? Okay, so here, this is my second to last slide. I've just mapped out the various technologies across the course of our 8 papers and broken them down into 3 categories. And these are all debatable, but one category you might think about are consumer goods, which in many cases, the speakers point out, become medicalized products. Next, we might think about tools and devices, so things like dialysis and new surgical techniques. And then also pharmaceuticals, including those used preventatively and for treatment. Down the right-hand side here, these are our less obvious or soft technologies based much more in human interactions, including those of information and dissemination, things like databases, ads, the internet, and then also more knowledge-based ones, including different kinds of standards and procedures of evidence, as well as structures of decision-making. And I've just noted patient groups in both because I think that they fit across both sections. Okay, so finally, in a more general sense, I think the history of technology provides us with a unique set of tools worth noting, if not ways to nuance or provide new language for how we're thinking about patients. So to me, the first is a matter of method. So just as longstanding efforts to focus more on patients in the history of medicine have brought us closer to sources like patient records and letters, those in the history of technology have shown us the value of putting technologies, as well as the social relations surrounding them, at the center of inquiry. And I think all of the presentations today and tomorrow are doing that. They're really following the device, following the technology. Second, technology also encourages us to think about users, which, if we consider those users to be patients, can be a useful way of moving away from stories centered on physicians and the hospital, which has sort of been the tradition in the history of medicine, at least before the 1970s or 80s. And I think the first point encourages that as well. And then the third, the history of technology is also a field that thinks differently about consumption itself. So whereas patient-consumer seems to either point to narratives whereby patients gain greater autonomy within medicine, or the flip side, offer up pretty reasonable critiques of the corporatization of care, historians of technology have thought about consumption as something equal in importance to that of the earlier stages of development and design. So in other words, we can ask, how are patients in consuming and using technology contributing to the very development and construction of those devices and techniques, if not reshaping their own experiences of health and sickness? Okay, so those are 3 points. There are others. I know some of the speakers, for instance, are thinking about how technology shift patients into different kinds of roles, be it as informants or activists. But in short, I'm excited about this work. I think I'll end there, and I'm interested in hearing more.